Chapter 24. 1 month later, Elizabeth was beginning to feel like her old self again. She returned to work, and though it was editing articles on her laptop while propped up with pillows on the sofa, she was grateful to be using her brain for something other than Sudoku. Again. Her physical therapy was reduced to once a week, and her body felt strong enough for lengthy walks around the city. The amount of intrusive medical appointments were becoming less frequent, as were the number of prescriptions she had to take. Her staples had finally been removed, allowing her hair to fall nicely over the shaved section as it grew back in. Even her scars were becoming less prominent thanks to the cream she rubbed on them every evening before bed. Although she didn't have much of a social life, Elizabeth was perfectly content to live vicariously through her sister, who spent much of her time with Dr. Dawson. In fact, the last thing on earth she wanted to do was start dating again. "You need to start dating," Jane exclaimed. She had just gotten home after a night out and found Elizabeth on the sofa watching Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth glared at her sister, her face set. "No." "You do." Jane plopped down next to her and kicked off her heels. "And I have just the guy for you." "Oh, really?" Elizabeth sat up straighter. "Is it Gonzo this time? The Swedish chef?" "Hell no," Jane gagged. "This guy looks nothing like Simon. And not only is he gorgeous, but he's also the best mate of Dr. Dawson." "I can't date someone who sails, Jane. I get seasick, remember?" "No, you dummy. Not first mate. Mate. Like the British way of saying friend." "Well, whatever," Elizabeth muttered, pulling the blankets over her bunny pajamas. "I don't want to date anyone. Ever." "But he's a doctor, Lizzie. He works with Dr. Dawson at the hospital." Jane smiled. "Seriously? He is absolutely perfect for you." Elizabeth narrowed her eyes in contemplation. The best friend of Dr. Dawson. A doctor. Someone whose status and income vastly exceeded her own. "It's Mr. Bingley." Well, obviously not the Mr. Bingley from her dreams, but possibly the next best thing? An actual live person that looked just like him? That might have his exact personality? Someone that she could meet and get to know and maybe even fall madly in love with? Elizabeth ripped off the blankets and placed her wine glass back on the table. "Okay," she agreed. "I will meet him." Jane looked pleasantly surprised by her sudden enthusiasm. "Brilliant! Because I already invited him over to dinner tomorrow night, along with Dr. Dawson. Aunt Tessa and Aunt Bridget are going away for the weekend with their boyfriends. You better go shave your legs. Those things are lethal." She grabbed the glass of Merlot from the table. "And no more wine. You know you're not supposed to drink it." Elizabeth stuck her tongue out at her. They both glanced at the television. Keira Knightley was making Matthew McFadden eat humble pie in the rain, while he gazed at her as if he were starving and she were made of pie. Or, in other words, Elizabeth's favorite scene of the movie. Jane watched, enthralled, for a few moments. Then she turned to Elizabeth, who was smiling at her hopefully. "I still think the one with Colin Firth is better." Elizabeth made a huffing noise and grabbed back her wine glass. She took a long sip as she made faces over the brim at Jane. The next evening, Elizabeth got ready for dinner slowly, taking her time to ensure she looked her absolute best. She put on a white dress made of a soft, floaty material with sheer capped sleeves. Her nude heels had a glossy sheen that she could almost see her reflection in. She gathered half of her hair up into a clip and curled the rest, then carefully applied her makeup. Stepping in front of the mirror, Elizabeth smiled as she was reminded of her reflection the night of the Netherfield ball. She breathed in deeply and exhaled, then went downstairs. A few minutes later, she was sitting on the sofa with a glass of red wine, hiding it behind a pillow whenever Jane entered the room. Her foot fidgeted as she stared anxiously at the door, and when the doorbell rang, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Elizabeth hurried to answer it, beaming when she saw Dr. Dawson standing there, handsome as ever, and unfortunately alone. "Dr. Dawson," she greeted him and sank into a curtsy. Blushing furiously, she stood up straight and gestured for him to come inside. He smiled and walked into the room, looking slightly perplexed. You can call me Will. Dr. Dawson sounds so formal when I'm off duty. Will? Yes, short for William, he replied with a smile. How have you been feeling, Miss Baker? If I get to call you Will, then you should probably call me Elizabeth, or Lizzie, she offered. And I feel great. Thank you. Well, you look smashing. He gestured to her dress. Char is going to be blown away when he sees you. He just finished his shift. He should be here any minute. Char? Elizabeth asked. Short for Charles? Will opened his mouth to answer, but was interrupted by Jane entering the room carrying 2 glasses of wine. Elizabeth held her hand out for one of them in jest. Jane raised it out of her reach and handed it to Will, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek and leading him into the living room. Elizabeth followed, and they had all just sat down when the doorbell rang once more. That's him, Will announced. I'll go get it. He left the room. Elizabeth felt her heart begin to race. Is this it? Am I actually going to see him again? She heard the men greet each other at the door. Her heart felt in danger of leaping right out of her chest as Will came back into the room, followed by his friend. When Elizabeth saw him, she felt her frantic heart plummet into her queasy stomach. This is Dr. Patel, Will introduced him, and this is Miss Elizabeth Baker, Jane's sister. As he gestured toward her, Elizabeth smiled weakly. It's so nice to meet you, Char offered her his hand. She realized she had been holding her breath and exhaled as she shook it. It's nice to meet you too, Dr. Patel. Please, call me Char. My given name is Charu, which is Indian for Prince Charming. 29 years ago, my mother was apparently obsessed with the Bollywood version of Cinderella. Cinderella Varasi. He smiled broadly, displaying a set of perfectly straight teeth that gleamed white in contrast to his mocha skin. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel disappointed as she sipped her wine and listened to Char's anecdote about an elderly patient that had kissed him on the lips during an exam. She studied him as he exclaimed, and it wasn't a woman, it was a man. That's right, I was snogged by a man who called me Barbara while I listened to his heart. He beamed at her as he waited eagerly for her reaction. She suddenly realized she had been frowning in concentration and smiled before giving a forced chuckle. As Char launched unabated into another story, Elizabeth tried to decide what it was that bothered her. She was on her first date in ages with an incredibly attractive man, a doctor to boot, and she felt absolutely nothing. He was handsome, funny, and had the most infectious laugh. So what was wrong with him? He's not Mr. Bingley. When the evening was over, Elizabeth walked Char to the door to say goodnight. She closed the door behind him and then went to the living room and plopped down on the sofa. Jane and Will were cleaning up in the kitchen. She could hear their carefree laughter as she pulled off her heels. Suddenly, the doorbell rang again. She went to answer it, wondering who in the world it could possibly be at this time of night. She opened the door to find Char peeking around a bouquet of flowers. These were on your doorstep, he said as he handed them to her. I wish I could say I brought them for you, but the hospital gift shop doesn't have anything this nice. Next time, I promise. He flirted and flashed her a dazzling smile. Elizabeth watched him walk down the steps and get into his car. Only then did she look closer at the flowers. She gasped. It was the same bouquet of wildflowers that had been in her hospital room. She set them down on the table and ran out of the door and down the steps before remembering she was barefoot. Her head darted back and forth frantically as she scanned the street. The only people she could see were a teenage couple holding hands and an old man walking his dog. No one who looked like they were out making flower deliveries. She walked back inside, smiling at the cheerful daisies and vibrant bluebells. Then she noticed a card tucked carefully in the middle of the bouquet. She grabbed it and stared at her own name handwritten on the front of the envelope. What is that? She looked up to see Jane eyeing the card. Elizabeth placed it behind her back and smiled. It's nothing, she said quickly. Just flowers Char forgot to give me. Isn't he great? Jane prompted her. I knew the two of you would hit it off. Now we can go on double dates. Yeah, sure. Elizabeth replied distractedly. She grabbed her shoes and struggled into them, her hand still hiding the envelope. I'm just gonna take a quick walk. She opened the door. Okay. Will and I might not be here when you get back. We were thinking we might go see a film. You sure you don't want to come? Oh, no, that's all right. You guys go, Elizabeth insisted. I'll just go to bed early, I think. Jane smirked. I wouldn't wait up. Elizabeth smiled and went to the door. She waited till she was sure Jane wasn't watching her from the window. Then she opened the card quickly and read the handwritten note inside. I know this is probably going to sound mental. I went to the hospital to bring you these flowers, and they told me you were discharged. I thought I would bring them myself. However, when I got to your door, I just couldn't seem to ring the bell. I was too nervous. I can't tell you how glad I am that you have recovered. I must have come across as completely pathetic when I found out you were gone, because the nurse on duty gave me your sister's address, and I don't think they're supposed to do that. I really hope she doesn't get in trouble for it. She told me you asked who sent all the flowers. I hope you didn't mind my bringing them. I have always loved wildflowers, and I thought maybe you might also. I came to visit you quite a bit while you were still unconscious, which I know makes me sound like a stalker, but I was so consumed with guilt, I simply had to see if you were getting any better. You see, I was the one driving the other car. I am so terribly sorry. I will never be able to apologize enough for the accident. I think about that night and you every minute of every day. If you never find it in your heart to forgive me, I completely understand. However, I would love the chance to apologize in person. I will be at the Nightingale pub tonight at 10 o'clock. If you can come, I would love to meet you. If not, I sincerely wish you every happiness. Charlie. Elizabeth read the note once, then a second time, and then a third as she tried to make sense of it. The person she had crashed into was a man named Charlie. He had been to visit her in the hospital several times. He was the one that brought her all the flowers, the wildflowers, and he wanted to meet her tonight. She reread the part where he mentioned the place and time. The Nightingale at 10 o'clock. Why did the name of the pub sound so familiar to her? And what time was it now? She realized she hadn't grabbed her phone when she left the flat. Elizabeth turned and ran as fast as she could in high heels. When she reached the door, she hurtled inside and grabbed her purse, checking her phone for the time. 9:30? Entering the name of the pub into Google, she gasped as she realized it was only 2 blocks from the flat. How had she never heard of it before? Elizabeth rushed to the bathroom and brushed her teeth, then reapplied her lipstick, then sprayed perfume on her wrists and rubbed them down on her neck the way she had watched her mother do it for years. She contemplated changing into her customary skinny jeans, but a quick glance at the time told her she would have to stick with her dress and heels. She left the flat and began to walk, filled with relief that she didn't have to drive Jane's car again. She didn't think she could ever drive in England again. A few minutes later, the pub came into view, and Elizabeth stopped and stared at the exterior. She had never been there in person, but there was something about the ivy-covered brick walls, flower-laden window boxes, and gingerbread-style roof that felt very familiar for some reason. She glanced up at the sign that hung over the second-story window. When she saw the bird perched on a branch, she gasped. The Nightingale. She did know it. She had known it almost her entire life. Ever since her parents began telling her their love story, this was the pub that her mother had stumbled into, weary after a long day at her unfulfilling job, and met the man of her dreams sitting at the end of the bar, where they talked until closing time, feeling as if they had known each other their entire lives. Elizabeth felt a chill despite the unseasonably warm night air and looked down to see that her arms were covered in goosebumps. She checked her phone again. 9:55. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped inside. As it was 10 o'clock on a Friday night, the pub was nearly full. Every table in the room was occupied, with people laughing and talking, drinks in hand. Elizabeth glanced around nervously. She didn't see anyone else that appeared to be alone in the crowd. She felt like she could use a drink to calm her nerves, and ignoring James' reprimand inside her head, made her way to the surprisingly empty bar and sat down. She ordered a glass of Merlot, and as she waited, she glanced down the bar, past the row of empty stools, to the only one that was occupied at the far end. Instantly, she froze when she spotted his blonde hair and the dimple in his cheek as he smiled and thanked the bartender for his beer. Elizabeth gulped and continued to stare, her heart performing somersaults in her chest as his icy blue eyes wandered in her direction. When he noticed her shocked expression, he locked his eyes onto hers. It was as if an electric current passed between them. Elizabeth suddenly felt unable to move or speak. It was him. No, it couldn't be him. And yet, it was him. The eyes, that smile, those dimples. Oh my God, he's smiling at me. What should I do? Before she could decide, he stood up from his stool and walked over to her, his eyes never leaving hers. It was definitely Mr. Bingley's face. Elizabeth would know it anywhere. He was wearing a navy argyle sweater pushed up to his elbows, dark washed jeans, and red Chuck Taylor All-Stars, which looked even sexier on him than breeches and a cravat. As he sat down next to her, she realized she was holding her breath again and exhaled nervously. Elizabeth, he breathed with a crooked smile. It was not a question. He greeted her as if he knew her. She smiled, dazed. He smiled back as he held out his hand. I'm Charles Bennet, he said, but you can call me Charlie. Elizabeth raised her eyebrows and grinned. She couldn't help it. Bennet? The sheer irony helped her find her voice. I'm Elizabeth Baker, she replied, taking his hand. But you can call me Lizzie. When she felt his skin touch hers, another jolt of electricity coursed through her entire body, and she shivered. So you found my letter? He asked sheepishly. I did, she conceded. There was an awkward pause before she blurted out, Thank you for the flowers, the same time that he exclaimed, I'm so sorry about the accident. What? No, she cried, shaking her head. The accident was all my fault. I should be apologizing to you. I'm from the States, you see. It was my first time driving on the wrong side of the road. She grimaced. I mean, the other side of the road. And it was snowing. It was so dark out. And then that horse ran out in front of me. It was massive and black. Did you see it? He frowned. No, I didn't see a horse, but it was so hard. It was hard to see much of anything but that snow. Elizabeth felt her eyes well with tears and wiped them hastily away. I'm sorry. I'm kind of a mess. You don't look like a mess to me, Charlie replied warmly. Besides, I'm the mess. I have been unable to think about anything else but you since they took you away in that ambulance. You have no idea how relieved I am to see you looking so perfect. He flushed scarlet and smiled. Elizabeth smiled back at him. Then she knit her eyebrows in concern. Did you get hurt? Just a few scrapes, nothing too serious, he assured her, gesturing to the thin scar just visible above one eye. They took me to the same hospital as you, but I was let go after a few hours. I went home and cried all night. Charlie bit his lip and looked away. I thought you were dead. Something in his voice and the look in his eyes made Elizabeth impulsively reach out and take his hand. I'm fine now, I promise. She gazed down at his so very familiar hand in hers. I'm so sorry you went through that. I can't imagine how you must have suffered this entire time. Charlie glanced back up at her, his blue eyes filled with tears. I'm sure it was nothing compared to what your family must have gone through. Yeah, my sister Jane won't talk much about it, but I think I caused her more than a lifetime's worth of anxiety, that's for sure. He nodded. I saw her a few times on her way out of the room. She was almost always crying. I didn't think it would help matters for me to introduce myself as the man you ran into. I tried to wait till you were alone to bring you flowers. Charlie shrugged. I probably went a little overboard bringing them every time. I just couldn't come empty-handed. Did you speak to me when I was in the coma? I did, mostly apologizing And a lot of crying, he admitted with a chagrin. I felt it was my fault that you were lying there so badly injured and unconscious. Elizabeth's eyes widened. All those nightmares I had where Mr. Bingley was crying. It wasn't Mr. Bingley, it was Charlie. Well, she mumbled, giving his hand a squeeze, it definitely wasn't your fault. She saw him glance down at their hands and she blushed. So, anyway, tell me about yourself, Charlie. What do you do for a living? I work at Hyde Park Stables. I give equestrian lessons to children. Elizabeth grinned. You seem like the type that loves horses. I really do, he acknowledged. I love that feeling you get when you're galloping along at breakneck speed. It's almost like you're flying. Elizabeth suddenly had a strange sensation she couldn't explain come over her. Her heart began to beat faster as she nodded at him. Exactly. Do you ride? Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. I did a long time ago. She suppressed a grin. A good friend recently helped me rediscover my love for it. They talked about everything under the sun, their families, their hopes, their likes and dislikes, until the bartender told him it was closing time. Elizabeth checked her phone once more. It was almost 2 a.m. Good thing Jane told me not to wait up. She knew how worried her sister would be if she came home and Elizabeth wasn't there. She grabbed her purse and they exited the pub. Can I walk you to your car? Oh, I walked, she confessed. I don't feel ready to drive just yet. Actually, I don't like being in a car at all anymore. She glanced down at her feet, feeling ashamed. Extending his arm toward her, Charlie lifted her chin gently, and she met his gaze. You do not need to explain yourself. I completely understand. He smiled. Would it be all right if I walked you home? Her breath caught in her chest at the familiar gesture. Sure. They continued to talk as they walked around the corner and down the street. As she listened to him describe his love for the kids he worked with at the stables, Elizabeth felt an irresistible urge to touch him. She casually brushed his hand with hers. When he didn't object, she wove her fingers through his. He gave her a boyish smile that she returned. When they reached the door of the flat, Elizabeth was suddenly overcome with trepidation. What if she said goodbye and never saw him again? What if she let go of his hand and he disappeared? She couldn't stand to lose him a second time. You know, I'm not tired at all, she ventured. Her heart raced in her chest. Would you like to come in and watch a movie? I can make some popcorn. Please say yes. That sounds smashing, Charlie agreed. Are you sure your family won't mind? They won't mind at all, seeing as they aren't here, she answered with a playful smile. They went inside and Elizabeth gestured for him to sit on the sofa while she made the popcorn. When she came back into the living room, she sat down next to him and handed him the bowl. She kicked her heels off and tucked her legs beneath her, then turned on the DVD player and watched as it automatically began playing the disc inside. A rush of humiliation washed over her as the opening credits for Pride and Prejudice appeared, along with the score of bewitching piano music. Elizabeth panicked. What if Charlie thought she was silly and sentimental for liking it? What if he, like everyone else in the world, thought the miniseries was better? She wasn't ready to face that level of insurmountable disappointment. She frantically tried to turn it off with the remote, but heard him say, "You don't have to turn it off. Let's watch this one. I love Pride and Prejudice." She looked at him in amazement. You've seen this movie before? Charlie nodded. Although, I must admit, I prefer the novel to the film. It makes me think how interesting it would be to live back then. It just seems to me the Regency era was so much simpler and more fulfilling of a world, doesn't it? Elizabeth nodded mutely and stared at him in disbelief. There's a lot to be said for the present, though, I'm beginning to think. The only thing I never really got is why Elizabeth fancies Darcy, he continued. I know women love him because he's rich and a bit of a dish. But then again, so is Bingley, and at least he knows how to have a good time. Darcy just seems like such a miserable bloke to me. Charlie pointed at the television and added, Matthew McFadden does a good job of making him a tad more likable. I love that scene in the rain. For that matter, everything about the film is better than the miniseries. Colin Firth was good. I'll give him that. He's definitely got that wet shirt bit going for him, but he was so much better in Kingsman than he was as Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth was overcome by a sudden, irresistible, uncontrollable desire that ignited like a flame inside her as she watched him speak with her mouth parted. She began to smile slowly until she was grinning, her eyes staring hungrily at his moving lips. When he finished his last sentence, Charlie gave her a curious look before she leaned forward and impetuously kissed him. Charlie raised his eyebrows momentarily in surprise, eyes wide with astonishment, then gave her a crooked grin. He placed both hands on the sides of her face and dove right in. Elizabeth reached around blindly for the remote. She found the power button, pushed it, and kept right on kissing him. Mr. Darcy, who? Gotta do the epilogue. I'll just keep going because there's a short epilogue now. 4 weeks later. Elizabeth hung her riding helmet on a nail and walked over to the stall to say goodbye to her horse. She stroked his chocolate muzzle, then walked out of the stable to where Charlie was wrapping up a class. She leaned against the barn door and smiled as she watched a little girl with curls cascading from under her helmet give him a high five, then shriek with delight as he handed her a sticker. As the last child left, he turned, and when he noticed her standing there, gave her a devastating smile and sauntered over to her. She threw her arms around his neck as he lifted her off the ground and kissed her. Brilliant ride today, darling? Smashing, she replied and kissed him again. They got into his car and drove to the flat where Elizabeth quickly showered, then changed into a comfy sweatshirt and jeans. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase and threw the strap of her carry-on over her shoulder, handing them off to Charlie in the doorway. As he left to put them in the car, she turned to look at Jane, who had tears in her eyes as she mumbled, Please be safe. Elizabeth smiled and hugged her tight. I will. She saw the sorrow in her sister's eyes and added, It won't be long, Jane, just a few weeks. I promise. Before you know it, I'll be back here in England. She held her at arm's length and gave her an earnest look. Back home. Jane nodded, smiling through her tears. Give Mom and Dad my love, she implored, and tell Aunt Bridget and Aunt Tessa I will pick them up at the airport in 2 weeks. Elizabeth gave her a hand salute. Aye, aye, Cap. Give Will a big hug from me. Tell him I will slay him at Go Fish when I get back. Jane grinned. I will. She gave her sister one last squeeze. Elizabeth turned to leave, then exclaimed, Oh, I almost forgot. She pulled a gift-wrapped present from her carry-on and handed it to Jane. This is for you. Jane took the thin rectangular package and opened it carefully to reveal a DVD. Kingsman? She puzzled. Elizabeth tapped the cover with her index finger. Now that is a Colin Firth I can get on board with. Watch it. You will not regret it. She smiled provocatively, waggled her eyebrows, then exhaled through pursed lips. Trust me on this. Jane smiled and walked her out to the car. She returned Elizabeth's wave as she climbed in, then watched the vehicle turn around a corner and out of sight. As the plane ascended over London, Elizabeth watched the city she loved grow increasingly smaller until the clouds veiled it in a blanket of white mist. She didn't feel the least bit sad. She knew she was only going back to Pennsylvania to pack the things that mattered to her and sell the rest. Then she would be moving back to London permanently. The magazine was allowing her to become a remote employee, but who knew? Maybe she would get a job at the stables and work with horses and kids. Both were quickly becoming a passion for her. And speaking of passion, she turned her head to the seat next to her where Charlie was sleeping peacefully. His eyelids fluttered as if he were in the middle of a dream. She gazed at him admiringly, wondering what he was dreaming about. Suddenly, she was struck by the realization that she no longer dreamed about Mr. Bingley, and hadn't for a long time. Not since the day she met Charlie. Not that it mattered to her if she ever dreamed again. Her new dream was sitting right next to her, and he was real. She reached down to grab a book out of her carry-on. As Elizabeth pulled it out, an envelope fell to the floor. She bent down to pick it up and realized with a gasp it was Brian's wedding invitation. She had completely forgotten about it. Opening it quickly, she found the RSVP card and saw she still had time to reply. She rooted through her bag for a pen and wrote her name carefully on the indicated line. Her eyes went uncertainly back and forth between accepts with pleasure and declines with regret. Then she remembered what Jane said about Brian coming to see her in the hospital. How he had canceled his flight and took time off work just to make sure she was all right. She could still see those beautiful roses. She checked the box for accepts with pleasure and went to the next line that read number attending. She glanced back at Charlie, still asleep, whose head was now resting on her shoulder. She kissed his forehead, then neatly wrote a number 2 on the line. Then she placed the envelope back into her bag and gazed out the window at the limitless horizon. That's the end of the book. Thank you so much for reading it with me. It was so much fun. And maybe we'll move on to the next one because there's another one. And then after that, there will be a third. So, yay. Thank you.